clearly this will cost all of you, as taxpayers, more than we had budgeted for. That's why the decision has been difficult and why it has taken time to decide the right course of action. I can confirm today that we are accepting the headline recommendations of the pay review bodies in full. But we will not fund them by borrowing more or increasing your taxes. It would not be right to increase taxes on everyone to pay some people more, particularly when household budgets are so tight. Neither would it be right to pay for them by higher borrowing, because higher borrowing simply makes inflation worse. Instead, because we only have a fixed pot of money to spend from, that means government departments have had to find savings and efficiencies elsewhere in order to prioritise paying public sector workers more. Now, there's a clear message here. There are always choices. Budgets are not infinite. When some ask for higher pay, that will always create pressures elsewhere, costs, which must ultimately be borne by the taxpayer or by spending less on our other priorities. So that's our decision. And having honoured the independent pay review process, I urge all union leaders to accept these pay offers and call off their strikes. Already, earlier this year, the NHS Staff Council, representing over half a dozen unions and over 1 million NHS workers, made a significant decision and voted to accept our pay offer and suspend strikes. I'm grateful to them and their members. And today, in response to the news of our decision, I'm pleased to say we've had another major breakthrough. All teaching unions have just announced that they're suspending all planned strikes immediately. Teachers will return to the classroom. Disruption to our children's education will end. And the unions have themselves confirmed that this pay offer is properly funded. And so they're recommending to their members an end to the entire dispute. So it is now clear momentum across our public services is shifting. The vast majority who just want to get on with their life's calling of serving others are now returning to work. And in that spirit, I want to address those yet to do so. Now that we've honoured the independent pay recommendations, I implore you, do the right thing and know when to say yes. In particular, for doctors and consultants, I would say this. We have a national mission for all of us to make the NHS strong again. The government has not only made today's decision on pay, we've backed the NHS with record funding, delivered the first ever fully funded long-term workforce plan, and met the BMA's #1 ask of government with a pensions tax cut worth £1 billion. So we should all ask ourselves, whether union leaders or indeed political leaders, how can it be right to continue disruptive industrial action? Not least because these strikes lead to tens of thousands of appointments being cancelled every single day, and waiting lists going up, not down. So, today's offer is final. There will be no more talks on pay. We will not negotiate again on this year's settlements, and no amount of strikes will change our decision. Instead, the settlement we've reached today gives us a fair way to end the strikes, a fair deal for workers, and a fair deal for the British taxpayer. Thank you. We'll take some questions from the media. Can I start with the BBC, please?
Thank you, Prime Minister. Chris Mason, BBC News. Will you acknowledge explicitly that a consequence of your decision will mean cuts in the budgets of some key public services? And explicitly on schools, given what you've just said about schools, where is the money coming from to pay for that? Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So, as I said in my speech, this is a significant pay award. It's one of the most significant we've had in decades, and it is costing billions of pounds more than the government had budgeted for, and that has consequences. If we're going to prioritise paying public sector workers more, that money has to come from somewhere else, because I'm not prepared to put up people's taxes, and I don't think it would be responsible or right to borrow more, because that would just make inflation worse. So what we have done are two things to find this money. The first is we're going to increase the charges that we have for migrants who are coming to this country when they apply for visas, and indeed something called the Immigration Health Surcharge, which is the levy that they pay to access the NHS. So all of those fees are going to go up, and that will raise over £1 billion. So across the board, visa application fees are going to go up significantly, and similarly for the Immigration Health Surcharge, for migrants who are coming to this country legally, they have to pay a fee to access the NHS, to contribute to NHS care. I think that's entirely right. Neither of these fees have been increased recently, and we think it's appropriate, given the costs for everything have gone up, that those fees, both for applying for visas and for accessing the NHS, go up too. That will raise over £1 billion, as I said, so it's a significant contribution to helping us pay for these pay awards. But also, we are reprioritising. So we are asking governments, departments to reprioritise to support public sector workers, and that will mean in other areas we will be, it's not about cuts, it's just about focusing on public sector workers' pay rather than other things. And I'm really pleased that the teaching unions specifically have said that they believe this pay offer is properly funded. We put more money into the teaching budget when I first became Prime Minister, £2 billion a year, and there will be more money going into the schools budget to help schools pay for these new pay awards. So they will not have to make cuts, and that was something that was rightly important to the unions, and we have worked with them to ensure that the funding is there for schools so that no cuts will need to be made. The pay offer is properly funded, and that's the basis on which the unions have called off their action, and I'm grateful to them and their members for that. Perfect. Next, can I go to the ITV?
Prime Minister, NHS leaders say there is no chance of them being able to reduce backlogs on treatments in the way that you want if they have to make savings. Are they going to have to make savings to fund part of this pay rise? And then separately, the Office of Budget Responsibility today has said that the UK's government debt is much more vulnerable to rising inflation than any other G7 leading country. Part of the reason is because of decisions you took as Chancellor on QE and on issuing index-linked gilts. Do you regret those decisions?
So on your second question, Robert, it's something you and I discussed a lot when I was Chancellor. Actually, you'll know we have one of the longest durations of government borrowing out of any G7 country, and have consistently reduced the amount of inflation-linked debt over years. That's been a downward trend. It's something that I pointed out as a risk to the public finances when I was Chancellor. And that's why I talked then about the risk to the country's public finances and economic security from rising inflation and interest rates. That's why my first priority is to halve inflation, because that is not only good for families' budgets, eases cost of living pressures, it will over time bring down interest rates, which is also good for government borrowing and the strength of the public finances. So you're right to highlight the risks of inflation and interest rates on the public finances. I highlighted the same risk as Chancellor, and that's why an important part of today's decision is, yes, we are accepting the recommendations of the pay review bodies, but we're doing so without borrowing more, because I don't think that would be responsible for all the reasons you outlined, and without taxing people more. Now, with regard to the backlogs in the NHS, look, I agree. Industrial action, strikes, make it far harder for us to cut the backlogs. Right? We've already had 500,000 people's outpatient appointments cancelled and disrupted by the strike action that we've seen today. It's an enormous number. And in spite of that, though, because of all the other things we're doing with the funding we're putting into the NHS, thanks to lots of people's hard work and creativity, we are making progress. So last year we eliminated practically the number of people waiting 2 years for treatment. This spring, we're practically eliminating the number of people waiting 1.5 years, and that's come down to just a few thousand now from over 100,000 at its peak. And we have plans in place to continue working on backlogs. But without the industrial action ending, of course, that will be more difficult. And that's why I would urge consultants and junior doctors to accept the recommendations of the independent pay review body. This is not even the government. This is the independent pay review body who has made a recommendation on their pay, which we have accepted in full, on top of all the other things we've done for the NHS, like the long-term workforce plan just the other week, something that has been called for decades, we have delivered. I would urge them to accept this offer from the independent bodies, and that way we can all work collectively together to bring the backlogs down. I know that that's what the vast majority of them want to see happen. That's what I want to see happen, and I'm prepared to work with them to do that.
But will the NHS have to make savings? You didn't answer.
As I said, one of the ways that we're raising money to pay for this is through the immigration health surcharge. That is money that goes to the NHS. So when people emigrate to this country, they have to pay something called the immigration health surcharge to contribute to the cost of the NHS, and the cost of that will go up as part of this announcement in order to raise more money for the NHS to help pay for some of these costs. And could I go next to Talk Radio?
Hello, Peter Cardwell, Talk Radio. Are you slightly hiding behind the independent pay review bodies here? The junior doctors are getting less than a fifth of the percentage point rise that you're asking. How do you honestly expect us, and expect them to believe that this is a fair offer when they're asking for so much more? And won't strikes be inevitable now in the autumn?
This is a process. The independent pay review bodies are a process that has existed for a very long time. Indeed, it's an institution and a set of institutions that the unions themselves called for, and for a long time it's been accepted as the best fair way that we have in this country to find resolution on public sector pay. Now, there are representatives of unions, of government, of economists on the boards of these public sector pay review bodies. They make independent recommendations to the government, and they do so in a range of sectors. And that's what we've accepted. Right? That's what we've accepted. And we've accepted their headline recommendations in full. For junior doctors in particular, I'd say like a typical junior doctor on pay point 3 is going to receive a significant pay increase, around 9%. As a result of us accepting the PRB's recommendation. I think most people think that is a significant pay increase. For a typical junior doctor, 9%. That is the pay increase that is being delivered as a result of our decision today. And that comes along all the other things that we've done for the NHS. Record funding, a long-term workforce plan fully funded so that there are more doctors, more nurses, more of every type of healthcare worker in the NHS for the first ever time. Funded expansion of training places that everyone has called for. And as those junior doctors progress to become consultants and are paid even more, they will benefit from the significant tax cut that the Chancellor announced in the spring budget, which was the BMA's #1 ask of government. Was that pensions tax cut? We've delivered it, and those junior doctors, as their careers progress, will benefit from that. So look, taken together, I think we've done the fair thing, and I would urge the junior doctors and consultants to see that, to see the commitment that we have to the NHS, to recognise the economic context that we're in and accept the recommendations of the independent pay review body, a process that is long established, is independent of government. We've done what I believe to be the right and responsible thing, and I would urge them to do the same thing too. Can I go to the Daily Mail?
Harriet Lyon, Daily Mail. How do you expect to bring down inflation to 5% when you're giving public sector workers a pay rise of in excess of 6%? And secondly, you said earlier this week that you didn't know who the BBC presenter facing serious allegations was. Were you shocked when you heard the news yesterday?
On your first point, Harriet, if you look at current pay settlements across different ranges, there's lots of different estimates and forecasts for what pay settlements in the private sector are averaging at the moment and are forecast to be. So whether you look at ONS data that was out the other day, Bank of England, Treasury has a panel that they use, expert HR survey data as well. All of that points to private sector pay settlements in the kind of 5 to 7% range now and over the course of the year. And I think the vast majority of these PRB recommendations fit within that type of range. So they are broadly, obviously it's going to vary for each individual person depending on what grade they're in, but broadly in aggregate, the pay settlements from the PRBs are in line with what we're seeing in the private sector. That's the first thing to say. I think the second thing I'd say is, is it inflationary, is it not inflationary? It's not going to be inflationary because we're not borrowing to fund it. And I think, and I've been very clear about this, everyone can see the economic context we're in. I'm determined to bring inflation down, and government has a responsibility not to excessively borrow money. If we do that, we just will make the situation worse and make it last longer. I'm not going to do that, which is why we have had to make some other decisions elsewhere on visa fees, immigration health surcharge, reprioritization, to pay for these pay settlements, because that's what being government means. It's about prioritising, it's about making choices, doing the difficult and responsible things. That's what we've done. But I am determined to bring inflation down, and this is one of the things that will help us do that, because we have not borrowed to fund these pay increases. Next, could I go to the Telegraph?
Hi, Ben Riley-Smith for Telegraph. Can I just drill into where the money's coming from? Because it's not coming from borrowing. About £1 billion coming from these visa fees. That leaves a couple of billion, I think, that needs to be found from reprioritization. Can you name a single thing that's going to be squeezed to get the money through reprioritization?
Yeah, it's not one big thing, Ben. It will be a range of things. So the Chancellor and I and the Chief Secretary have engaged in an exercise with departments for a while. And I think many of you are asking, when are we going to see this decision on pay? When are we going to see it? It's because we've been taking the time to go through everyone's budgets to make sure that there are areas that where we can find reprioritizations from, where we're maybe not spending as much as we had anticipated, that we can shift over to public sector pay without impacting frontline service delivery, because that was very important to us. It was also important to the schools unions, and that's why they are confident that there is extra money going into the schools budget to make sure that these pay offers are fully funded. So it's not one big thing, it's just painstaking work of going through every department's budget line by line, finding every little bit of saving or where we're not quite spending as much as we thought, where we can shift that to public sector pay to make sure our workers are rewarded and that we honour the recommendations of the pay review bodies. But what I would say is that does mean choices, right? And I'm not shying away from that, because I think that's the right thing to do. But because we're raising money through fees and the immigration health surcharge, that contributes significantly and will ease some of that pressure. The Guardian, I think, lastly. We've got time. Yes.
Hi, Pippa Kerr from The Guardian. You talk about reprioritisation of what sounds like it's going to be about £2 billion worth of money. Can you guarantee that that decision won't mean more front-line cuts? Let's just call a spade a spade. And secondly, can I just ask you if you can give us a status update on Liz Truss's resignation peerages? Are we likely to see them over the summer?
Pippa, on the previous question, it's the same thing. We have protected frontline services. So I think the teaching unions would not have supported this offer if they didn't believe that there was money coming into the core schools budget to help pay for these significant pay awards. So we've worked through the detail of that with them specifically to make sure that they are comfortable in how we're doing this. And as you can see, I very much welcome the engagement we've had with them, the constructive way that they've approached those conversations, and indeed their announcement today, which I think is enormously wonderful news for our children. It's important that we get them back into the classrooms and catching up on what they lost out on COVID. So I'm delighted with today's news. And more broadly, whether it's NHS or everywhere, we've funded the frontline services actually very generously, and we're now going to deliver on improving, as I said, people's waiting times for electives and all the rest of it. I haven't got an update for you on residential honours. They haven't come to me yet, and as I think you know, I tend to just follow the due process on these things. And I also, someone had a question before about the BBC. Look, I wasn't, sorry, I just forgot, I wasn't ignoring your question, but I would say, look, I think for all the reasons that everyone is aware of, this is an incredibly sensitive matter, and what I'd say is that the BBC is going through its process of fact-finding and establishing what's happened. The right thing is for them to get on with that, and for us to give them the space to do that and recognise the sensitivity of this for all involved. And there's nothing more than that I can or should say, I think, at this point. Good. I think that's it. We've got one time. Last one. Yeah, times.
You're standing up in front of a pledge to halve inflation, but minister after minister has refused to say what that means, what the actual target will be. Is it 5%? 5.35%, 5.5%. Can you today level with people and just say exactly what that target is, so we know what metric to judge you by? I
think that everyone can see what inflation was when I made that announcement I made the announcement in January, and we had the numbers, I think, for December last year. But look, do I think that everyone sitting at home is focusing on whether inflation goes down to 5.2, 5.4, 5.3? No, I don't. Actually, what I think they want to know is that the government is committed to easing the burden on their cost of living, and that is my priority. And halving inflation is the most important step we have to doing that. And I want to do that over the course of this year. Clearly, that's become more challenging. Everyone can see that in the numbers, but that doesn't mean it wasn't the right thing to say. I am ambitious for our country. When I set those targets or priorities, lots of people said, well, that's all going to be too easy. You said all these things that you're going to easily meet. That was what people said. I didn't believe that. I thought it would be tough. But I thought it was the right thing to do because that's the way that we can bring maximum benefit to people's families up and down the country. And we're going to absolutely stick to the course. That's why today's decision is important, as I said. It wouldn't have been right to accept these pay offers and then fund them with borrowing. That would have been the easy thing for me to do. Wouldn't have involved me having to put fees up everywhere else on visa fees or immigration health surcharge. Wouldn't have involved, detailed work trying to find savings and reprioritization from elsewhere. It would have been easy, but it would have been wrong. It wouldn't have been the responsible thing to do for the country because I'm determined to bring inflation down, and I'm confident that we will do so. And halving inflation is just a staging post because inflation belongs back where it should be at 2%. Right? So, this is a journey to get it down there, but that was the first step on the journey. But people should be left in no doubt about my resolve to deliver on it. Perfect. Thank you very much for your time.